So here's a tech video that applies to everybody across the board. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a muscle car or restoration, a stock daily driver, a drag car, an off-road car. It doesn't make any difference. This actually applies to everybody across the board. If your car has brakes, this is for you. So before I even get into the nitty-gritty of it, let me explain what led us to making this particular video. A couple of days ago, we took our Plan Z Dart on the side of the shop over here, and we decided to let's start working it in, right? So we get a couple of burnouts done and a couple of launches. And what we found was that the car pulled violently, right, to the right during a burnout. Let's figure out what's going on here. So right away there was like 10,000 comments. The road is pitched. No, the road isn't pitched. The road is level. The suspension is screwed up. The suspension is good, right? It's got good leaf springs. It's got an air shock on the right rear. It's all preloaded. It's all good. That's not a problem. The tires are different diameters. No. What happened was the car, as I let off, just went crazy out like that. So, all right. And it didn't feel quite right. It was like weird getting the burnout started. So what happened was, this wheel cylinder right here is seized. Now, why did that wheel cylinder seize? When we last played with this car about 3 years ago, everything was fine. The brakes were fine, the function was fine, but it sat for about 3 years. And in that time, this wheel cylinder rusted internally. So why did that happen, and how does this apply to everybody? Well, it has to do with brake fluid, the nature of brake fluid. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, meaning that it absorbs moisture from the air, and it holds that moisture in suspension. And the reason it does this is because any moisture that finds its way into the braking system, if it was to gather in one place, it would lower the boiling point of the fluid. So you would step on the brakes when everything got hot, you'd step on the brakes and that's it, nobody home. So brake fluid is designed to hold water in suspension, but it does absorb it from the atmosphere. So in this case, while the car sat, the gasket on the master cylinder here is bad, right? It's just a junk gasket, and so it was able to absorb moisture from the air as it sat. And then what happens is, as that moisture finds its way into the reservoir, the water molecules gravitate through the brake system, and after an extended period of time, after a year, 2 years, 3 years, that water will eventually all gather and congregate at the furthest points away. So in our case, wheel cylinder. Evidently, there's no problem with the back brakes. The reservoir for the back brake seems to have sealed well. It's the reservoir for the front brake. You can even see by the fluid had that contaminated look to it. So this doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with a drum brake car like this is, or disc brakes. The principles are all the same. That moisture in the brake fluid is going to gravitate to its furthest point, and wherever it gathers, it meets cast iron and it rusts. And that's what happened here. And the way I found this was simply enough. I just stood on the brake with the wheel spinning, and the wheel kept spinning. And I put enough force on the pedal that I said, oh, it's going to pop a hose, right? I mean, I just stood on this thing, but the wheel just rolled like there was nothing to it. So it's seized solid. And like I said, it doesn't make any difference whether it's a disc or a drum brake car. The effect is going to be the same. Well, it's a little bit different. There's a little variation to it. On a drum brake car with wheel cylinders, they'll rust the pistons solid in the bore, so the piston won't be able to move out. On a disc brake car, disc brakes operate at a higher pressure level than drum brakes do. And so there'll be enough pressure to push the caliper out and apply the brakes, but because the bore is surface rusty, it won't want to retract, and so it'll drag the brake. And actually, something, that's a very common cause of mysterious overheating problems, and I've had this happen to myself. And it's especially vulnerable to, let's say, 60s, 70s cars, underpowered daily drivers, and what'll happen is you'll develop a mysterious overheating problem. and you'll go crazy. You'll change the thermostat, you flush the radiator, you go through all of the different stuff. You add a shroud, you add extra fans, but no matter what you do, it'll still overheat. You'll drive the car for, let's say, 20 minutes, a half hour, and then suddenly the gauge just keeps going and going and going. More often than not, and I've seen this happen many times, more often than not, the brakes are dragging. And it's such a light drag, and it's such an underpowered kind of situation that the engine is working. The fan isn't spinning fast enough, the water pump isn't spinning fast enough to meet the amount of work that the engine is doing, and it'll slowly, the temperature will just creep up until it overheats. Very common problem with older cars. So, we know the brake fluid is hygroscopic. The exception would be the .5 stuff, the silicone stuff. But you can't just pour that into any old brake system. The whole brake system has to be designed for that .5 fluid. So, unless your car is originally designed for .5, forget about that. .1 through 4, 3 and 4. You got to flush them. This is, a lot of people, so the oil change places, dealerships always made a big deal of flushing brake fluid. And on the surface, it looks like it's one of those rip-off services. But there's nothing wrong with the brake fluid. It's not like engine oil. It doesn't pick up contaminants. No, the flushing of brake fluid every 3 years, 30,000 miles or so, prevents this from happening. It takes that water that's been in suspension for all of that time, it flushes it out, and you throw fresh in there. If you've got one of these older cars, be very careful, be very mindful of the sealing condition of the master cylinder. So, like I said, on this one, this gasket, I pop this off of here. And this gasket right here, you can see the rust around the outside of this part of the gasket. And if you look at the fluid, you can see the color difference between this is the reservoir for the front brakes, this is for the back brakes. And look at how this one looks rusty. This one had just enough of a gap in the gasket to let moisture get into this reservoir, and that's what gravitated through the brake lines and ended up at that wheel cylinder. You want to make sure that the top of your master cylinder, this one's got a lot of surface rust on it. I mean, it looks like it's a nice master cylinder, but it's got a lot of surface rust, so before we put this back into service, this has got to be completely cleaned out. This gasket, I don't know if I can get just a replacement gasket for it, but I'll do whatever I can to clean this up and make sure that it seals as well as it can. And again, see, for something like this, which is a limited use car, it's really not that big of a deal. Unless it sits again for an extended period of time, it's not going to matter. But if you've got a classic that you're putting into storage or you use every day, then it's important to make sure that these surfaces are actually, sealed. So that's it for now. I'm going to get the wheel cylinder in there. It's funny, we talk about cars and like what kind of car should you work with, what what shouldn't you work with, what's difficult. Went to the auto parts store this morning to get the wheel cylinder, and the listing for the wheel cylinder on these cars, you say, well, it's a 52-year-old car. What are the chances of a regular auto parts store having a wheel cylinder in stock for it? Well, the rears actually fit certain cars like Mazdas and whatnot into the 2000s. Ford Rangers, lots of cars use that same wheel cylinder. And the same thing with the front. The front has many different applications. And so when you're dealing with a common car like this that has common parts, you can still get common brake parts over the counter, and they're dirt cheap. You don't have to go hunting for them. So that's one of the reasons why I try to stick with this type of car, because there are so many different things that are just any auto parts store. Go get it. Get you down the road. That's it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.